This is the BioCentury Show. Brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds. Join BioCentury and Insights partner McKinsey & Company this September in Nashville for an R&D forum at the interface of industry and academia.
Hello and welcome to the BioCentury Show. I am Simone Fishburn, Editor-in-Chief at BioCentury, and it is really my pleasure to be joined today by John Maraganore, founder and former CEO of Alnylam Pharmaceuticals, who's known now as an active and leading voice in the biopharma industry. John built Alnylam from the ground up to a $20 billion plus company, together with Barry Green, who served as president. Since handing the reins over to Yvonne Greenstreet in 2021, I want to point out she is another BioCentury Show guest. John has joined Arch as a venture partner, joined several prominent and smaller biotech boards, and is on the board of Bio. He is also passionate about nurturing the next generation leaders through mentoring as a member of the board of the Tamir Foundation, continuing the legacy of Henry Tamir, and as an advisor to Nucleate. And on top of that, he is the chair of the N. Lorem Foundation Advisory Council and on the advisory board of Ariadne Labs to advance global health system innovations. You are not idle, John. I think that's whatever you're doing at Alnylam, you seem to have filled all that time and more. Right? And I want to frame this discussion a little bit in the context of your learnings from Alnylam and the things that do and don't carry forward to today. So when you started Alnylam, siRNA, I would say, was a pretty edgy technology, right? There are now several drugs approved, but, that took a while. That was also a boom era, followed by some not so boom era. But the whole industry was much younger then, right? And,
Yes.
Now there is an incredible amount of scientific discovery. You call this mind-boggling. Many new modalities, a lot of disease biology being uncovered. So are there lessons from that era that carry forward today? More specifically, we've got a lot of new modalities. What do they face? Can they all make it? Will some become niche products? Or are we really looking at a hugely expanded armamentarium for physicians to choose from? It's a sort of fairly big question, but I'm wondering if you can sort of talk about how you're looking at innovation today.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, I think there's just so much innovation going on in our industry right now. And one of the areas for sure is the advent of new modalities for the treatment of human disease. And RNA interference, now 5 products that have been approved, actually 6 products that have been approved and brought to market. I think that modality will, frankly, I think that modality will rival monoclonal antibodies as a modality. We'll see how that goes over the next 20 years, but I think we're at the cusp of seeing that modality rival what happened with monoclonals. But then you've got other modalities that have emerged. I mean, certainly AAV gene therapies, there's 8 or 9 approved gene therapy products right now in the US, and many more that are coming. I think that's another important modality for genetic medicines. And then you have gene editing. And of course, we saw last year the approval of the first gene editing product for sickle cell, which is a major milestone. That discovery or that approval happened within about 11 years of the original Doudna paper, as compared to 19, 20 years for Alnylam's first product after the Fire-Mello paper. So to some extent, we're seeing an acceleration of time to get these modalities to patients in need, in part because of the fact that the framework for this type of discovery, this type of innovation, has now been adapted by regulators, by patients, physicians, and so forth. And we can see a massive acceleration happening, I believe.
So I wanted to ask you about that because a lot of the discoveries today really require innovation beyond the actual therapeutic, meaning you might need new endpoints or new analytical methods. Is that something that you had to forge also with siRNA? And can you talk a little bit about that? Have we got better at innovating in those areas and working with the agency?
Yeah, I think we have. I mean, in fact, the first product we brought to market for a monogenic disease was in an indication where there were no approved products in the US. And so we had to forge forward with a clinical study design as well as clinical endpoint structure that had never been tested from a regulatory or phase 3 execution perspective. And we were able to do that. And I think that's going to be true with a lot of the innovation that's coming forward from gene editing pioneers and other companies as well, where, notwithstanding the great science they're doing, they also have to move ahead with some advancement. And I do think the regulators understand that. Many of us have seen and heard comments from Peter Marks, for example, around how he's thinking about some of these new modalities and how he's thinking about being flexible, working with the innovator to ultimately bring these products forward, all for the benefit of patients. And I do believe that the regulatory framework today is frankly much stronger than it was when we started Alnylam back in 2002, in terms of the ability and interest of the FDA to work with sponsors in helping design the right type of studies.
So, one of the things that I think is interesting, you talked about siRNA sort of sitting alongside monoclonals or even maybe ahead of them in some diseases. But I don't think all things are equal. And, we see CAR-Ts, for example, extending into autoimmune diseases. But at the same time, now we start to see there are some real safety liabilities with those that might limit whether you could actually use them more broadly. For gene editing, I have heard some people argue it should never be used where there's a more traditional alternative because the safety will never be good enough. So, do you think you end up with a series of sort of niche products here? And you're still really talking about small molecules, monoclonals, and maybe siRNA or a few others. Is there really room for everything?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think you never want to say never in this industry and in this life, in this world. I mean, I think when we started our journey at Alnylam with siRNAs for as new medicines, we logically said, let's go to the apex of unmet need. Let's go to the place where the unmet need is the absolute highest. Let's go into monogenic diseases where we have a rare disease population and an enormous disease burden. Those were very logical things to do, and obviously that resulted in the first approvals in these rare disease settings. But then we saw the approval of the first product for treatment of hypercholesterolemia coming out of RNAi. And that medicine, I believe, can have profound impact. And now RNAi is imagined for more prevalent diseases as well. Now, with gene editing, the same type of challenges are being faced as we speak. The first approval was in sickle cell, and then you see some people looking at more prevalent disease opportunities. Look, I think it's going to take some time to make that change, but there will certainly be patients with highly morbid conditions and segments of a larger disease population that could benefit from a gene editing strategy. So I think we have to keep an open mind at the end of the day. I do think personally that having a reversible therapy is probably going to be better for some of these more prevalent disease settings, but let's see how it plays out.
So I want to talk about one particular disease area. And one of the areas that came up when we chatted previously was the incretins and obesity. Now, I mean, these are just astonishing products that could just have tremendous societal impact, in my view. I think we all know that there's room for improvement. At the same time, the bar is very high and the trials will be very large and expensive. So my question to you as you work with small companies is, how should they think about this? Is this an area where sort of incremental benefits, most areas sort of move forward with incremental benefits? Is that going to work in obesity? Or do we really need to be bringing forward transformational things for them to be realistic?
Simone, when I was at Biogen many years ago, 30 years ago, and we were there at the beginnings of bringing products forward for multiple sclerosis, there was nothing else at that time approved. There was Betaseron and Avonex. were the two drugs that we as an industry brought forward for MS. And now there are, 15, 16, maybe 17 medicines in multiple sclerosis, all dealing with aspects of the disease and in a way that has tremendous benefit for patients. So in the obesity space, I think we're just still at the beginning. Obviously there's been amazing pioneering efforts by Novo and Eli Lilly in that regard. And I think we're learning about how we can improve upon those type of medicines. I was involved with I'm a partner with Atlas Ventures as well, and I was involved in a company called Versanis that was developing an antibody bimagrumab for improving the quality of weight loss without muscle loss in the setting of obesity. And ultimately, that product got acquired by Eli Lilly. But that's the type of innovation that you'll see coming out of this industry now.
Right, but let's just I just want to come back because MS didn't require the kind of size of trials that obesity does. And so does that mean that for a small company, you might be able to produce an incremental benefit that could end up being an add-on or a combo or something, but at the end of the day, you're going to need to put it in the hands of one of the farmers? I think you at Alnylam built a company that could go all the way. Is that really something you could do now if you're a small obesity company?
I think the obesity indication and more prevalent indications always represent a challenge for the biotech innovator if they want to try to go all the way. There's no doubt about that. But it's not a bad model to expect the innovator to take the product to a certain point in time, maybe phase 2 evidence, whatever the case might be, and then to have a partnership with one of the large players that are in the space. I would imagine that virtually every pharmaceutical company will be in the obesity space at the end of the day. Certainly many of them, those that are not in it right now, are talking about how they can get in it at some point in time. So I suspect that partnership structure will be there, and many of the innovators will ultimately find partners to work with.
Yeah, I think we are seeing some come back in. I think, we had that a little bit with immuno-oncology. It's like, no, I'm not going to get in. Oh, actually, I need to get in. So, I think you're right that we'll see that a little bit. I wanted to talk a little bit now because we've sort of gone into this area of bridging on your mentorship and how you work with small companies. And you and I, of course, talked for our back to school project last year, where we dug into what it takes to build a long-term sustainable company. Now, in the introduction, I talked about Barry Green, and, you and he had a very sort of tight partnership. How reproducible is that model? Was that something that just was a chemistry, or do you actually advise, young entrepreneurs and first-time CEOs, to have that kind of a relationship in their leadership team?
Simone, in the history of biotech, there are so many examples of duos or trios that ultimately partner together to build a great company. Look at Len and George at Regeneron. That's a magic duo. Look at John and Norbert at Gilead. All right. So these are just some examples. And I think it's actually a very common feature of successful biotech companies where you've got, one individual who might be the CEO, might be, the number 2, whatever the case might be, working with a counterpart in a way that's extremely complementary with each other, right? I mean, Lonnie and Mary Lynn at Tesaro, example. I mean, this is just one other example, and I think the beauty of that model is that there's no individual who's got all the attributes it takes to build a successful company. They need their number 2 or their number 3 to really do it. I also, you could have mentioned Akshay Vaishnaw, who was our head of R&D, also a critical part of building Alnylam. Alnylam really was built by a team. It was built by me and Barry and Akshay Vaishnaw, and then obviously a much bigger team beyond that. But it wasn't just one person. And it never, I think arguably can never really be one person at the end of the day.
And so how much of this sort of mentoring experience do you take into the boards and the other environments that we talked about in the introduction for where you're working? I mean, is this something you see people engaging with, or do they sort of feel, no, I got this, I'm going to be the leader by myself?
No, I think I with a lot of my mentoring, I spend a lot of time talking about the need to have people on your team that you can partner with at the end of the day. It's so important, no doubt about it. And I think, Simone, I mean, we all know that the number one limiting force between science and patients and is not money, it's not the science, of course, it's people. And so having the right people there with the right experience and the right track record, the right scars on their back and so forth, it is so critical at the end.
John, we're going to take a brief break now. And when we come back, I'll have a couple more questions on your role as a mentor, and then we're going to talk about some geopolitical things. All right.
Great.
This September in Nashville, BioCentury launches Grand Rounds, a new interdisciplinary R&D forum at the interface of industry and academia. Join BioCentury and a rich roster of innovators and key thought leaders to identify leading-edge discoveries and discuss urgent challenges that must be solved to translate these innovations into product development and medical practice. Meet academic innovators, physician scientists, early-stage investors, and biopharma R&D leaders for 2 days of networking, partnering, and debate. Register at biocenturygrandrounds.com.
I'm back at the BioCentury Show with John Maraganore. John, let's just continue in your role as a mentor and your activities as a mentor. This is a very hard capital environment now. I think people hope or feel that it's softening a bit, but the sentiment really still seems to be about a world of haves and have-nots. What are you seeing in the small companies and among entrepreneurs? What is the temperature there?
I mean, it has been a very difficult capital market environment over the last 2-3 years. And you're absolutely right. Things are getting better. I think interest rates are coming down. Inflation has been curbed. We're starting to see the green shoots that everybody's been looking for. And I'm very, very hopeful that things will recover very nicely. And look, you know, I've been in the industry for almost 40 years now, and we've seen these cycles before. This is not uncommon. This one might have been deeper and a little bit more challenging than most, but we've seen it before at the end of the day. So I think a lot of CEOs that I've been working on mentoring over the past couple of years now really found it challenging to capitalize their companies, advance the science because of where the capital markets were. Many of them succeeded. Many of them were able to get the financings done that they needed to get done, but others, weren't successful. They either had to, close up shop or minimize their aspirations, whatever the case might be. So it wasn't without some, negative consequence at the end of the day. But thankfully, many entrepreneurs figured their way through it. And the great news is now that they've figured their way through this tough period, they're going to be facing a much more positive environment for funding their companies in the coming years. And that's wonderful. That's wonderful. It won't last forever, but it will be there for the next coming years.
Right. And so, your point about this is cyclical, I think I certainly feel one of the benefits of getting older is that I know that nothing lasts forever. That unfortunately holds for the good things too. On the other hand, I think we have to recognize that it is both a different world inside and outside of biotech. And inside of biotech, there is just, going back to the idea of the amount of innovation, there is just so much more competition, we call this rising above the noise. And that's going to remain, right? And I think that is, my question really is that different from what you face? Do you think companies have to have completely different strategies for finding investors and partners and differentiating themselves? Has that bar risen, and how are they coping?
I think the bar has absolutely risen, and I think that's a good thing. I think companies truly need to be developing distinct, differentiated, and high impact medicines. And if they're not doing that, they're not going to get funded, plain and simple. I think that the bar has gotten higher because science has gotten so much better. The underlying technology, the tools are there. And even though, people have been complaining about the capital market environment over the last 2-3 years, it's still a hell of a lot more money than was available for the biotech sector when we started Alnylam back in 2002. A hell of a lot. I don't know what the numbers are, but it's probably at least two, maybe threefold higher access to or availability of capital now than before. And that does raise the bar in terms of what you have to ultimately do as an innovator. You really do have to think about that. There's also been this phenomenon of having significant crowding, I would say, of people around certain indications. Look at what's going on with autoimmune disease now, based on the discoveries of George Schett, but also other B-cell strategies that have emerged. So there's a whole range of different approaches that are now going after diseases like, SLE and myositis and myasthenia. But, that's fantastic. It's great to see all that innovation come forward. And the winners will ultimately emerge over time. We don't know who they are yet, but there will be winners at the end, and there will be people that don't quite make it at the end. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's a sort of interesting thing, because you talked about, and I think what you're talking about is people taking CD19 CAR Ts into B-cell diseases and autoimmunity, going from cancer to autoimmunity, and the different indications that could reach. We've written about some of the things coming out of the cancer conferences and the other conferences in that line. But at the same time, the last few years, at least leading up to, in the bull run, we saw a lot of companies piling in to the same targets, the same indications. PD-1 is probably the biggest area, but it's not the only one. Is that going to continue to be a hallmark? And how do you think about that?
I think that entrepreneurs who believe that they've got the magic approach for a given area are going to give it a shot. They're going to give it a swing at bat. Whether they make it or not will totally depend on their science and whether their science prevails at the end of the day. I think it's a good thing to allow that to happen, to have a framework where larger numbers of innovators come forward with their big ideas, and then we see which ones are really going to be successful at the end.
What you have, like, let's say you've got a new modality, you now have this question of what indication do you go for? Do you go for an indication where there's nothing else there, but you've got then indication or target risk at the same time as your modality risk? Or do you try and prove the modality? And I would ask whether in this capital environment, you have the luxury of the latter. You have the luxury of just proving your modality, even if it's an indication where other things are working.
No, you have to. It's not that easy anymore. You have to. You have to absolutely marry up your modality approach, where you want to make a difference, with opportunity, with the unmet need, with where you can excite investors around the potential of what you're going to do. Okay, and if you can't make that case, then you're going to have a hard time getting funded. There's no doubt about it. You've got to be able to make that case. And so I think, again, the bar is higher now than ever before. We do see a lot of innovation going on in the AI space, as an example, right now. I do think it's good to see all that innovation happen. There aren't going to be, everybody's not going to win. The 100 companies that have gone into the, let's cure lupus area, all of them are not going to win. Some will. And that's fantastic. And the patients will win no matter what, which is great at the end of the day.
I think we have to acknowledge that for a long time, no one was going in. At least no one was going in successfully. So,
That's it. That's it.
John, let's switch gears a little bit. And I want to talk about a couple of very big overhangs in the industry. Drug pricing and the BioSecure Act. Now, you are on the board still at Bio. You were previously chair, and you have spoken up for years about drug pricing. The IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, has made many drug makers worried, and there are fears it's going to dampen small molecule drug development in particular, and that's bad for patients. On the other hand, I can tell you that we see continued investment in small molecules more than any other modality. McKinsey's recent report at BioEquity and our data show the same. There are other leaders who say that this focus on the IRA is just short-term thinking, and the industry has to reconfigure for the long term how it goes about drug development, which might be easier said than done. What are your thoughts about this? Is it hysteria? Is it very real concerns about Inflation Reduction Act?
Well,
Where are you?
no, I think the concerns are very real. I mean, look, we have an industry that is fundamentally resilient. So yes, it will survive. It will get through this. I don't believe that the innovation will stop, nor should it. And we'll find our way through this new change. But it has very bad consequences. I mean, notwithstanding the data around the investment levels in small molecules and so forth, which I believe, and I think small molecules remain important medicines to discover. It is going to change the paradigm of how partnering takes place, how M&A takes place, how the capital ecosystem ultimately takes place around small molecules versus antibodies. I'm actually hopeful that we can fix that small molecule penalty. I think it doesn't make any sense. I think it might not be fixable this year. It's an election year, but I think after this election, I think we can start working with lawmakers to fix that. And I think a lot of the people that are doing the investments in small molecules right now actually believe that that's addressable in the future. So I'm actually hopeful there. But the IRA was an unfortunate piece of legislation. I think it was a largely driven in part by some of the actions of some companies in our sector who, frankly, didn't think about the long game. They thought about the short-term game at the end.
And so what should the long game be?
The long game should be innovation and making a big difference in patients' lives. That's it. That is it. And if we continue to put that front and center of everything we do, we will succeed and be remarkably successful.
The industry's done that for the last 20, 30 years. They've innovated. The industry has innovated. It's come up with new drugs. It's revolutionized cancer treatment. There's other indications that are just a completely different landscape. The issue still comes down to pricing, and that's and even how industry is organized. And so,
well, the industry also did annual price increases for a long time, and then created pay for delay schemes with their IP that they should have let biosimilars or generics come forward. So the industry has done a number of things that have polluted the social contract that really existed. Now we have a new element of that with the IRA. But I think the industry has made some errors on that at the end of the day, no doubt about it.
Well, let's go to another area, the BioSecure Act, which I think a lot of people think of that as another arrow for this industry, even though obviously, as with the IRA, by the way, most people think about the IRA as something that is good for green energy and so on. It's just biotech that is worried about this. But the BioSecure Act, effectively can really lead to a decoupling, or even is meant to lead to a decoupling from China. And China has become essential for many manufacturing and supply chain issues, and is really core to drug development. Our own survey really pointed to the tremendous impact that it could have, even though there's obviously some amendments that might go through since then. What are you seeing and hearing, and how do you think this is going to play out?
Look, I think the BioSecure Act is obviously aimed at preserving national security. I think everybody wants national security, but I think we have to be realistic about the impact on the industry as it relates to a global supply chain. And the industry has relied on a global supply chain for decades now. And the BioSecure Act, if enacted, depending on how it's enacted, could cost the industry billions of dollars to change how it accesses API, if not even raw materials at the end of the day. And I am concerned about that, because I think it will take decades to nationalize a supply chain. And I'm not even sure a nationalized supply chain really is the right answer at the end of the day, versus having a supply chain that can be predominantly global. So it is a new act. I think Bio has been very, very involved with this now to try to get it to a good place at the end of the day, where we can preserve our national security interests while also retaining the needed access to raw materials and API. I think there are some positives of this, of course, which is the opportunity to get our country, the US, focused on the importance of biotechnology, focused on the importance of domestic manufacturing. So I do believe there's some upside there, but I think overall, I think it has to be done very, very carefully so that we don't ultimately disrupt access of medicines for patients.
Right. And that's sort of, I would just wanted to touch very briefly on that, whether the US and other Western countries, should have invested more in onshoring or, in manufacturing domestically, and, whether that's actually viable to build up in a reasonable time frame. Those things don't happen overnight.
Well, I have my concerns, Simone. It's not just the build up of the manufacturing capacity; it's also the training of the people that's needed to ultimately, run these plants and facilities. And I'm not sure if the American workforce is really, ready for that type of opportunity at the end of the day. So I think we'll have to see. This will hopefully get reviewed before it becomes law, so that we ultimately can get to a good place. And so I am hopeful that BioSecure, when it's finally enacted, will have the right type of guardrails in place so that ultimately patients can get their medicines. I mean, that's what is most important here. And to the extent that BioSecure also wants to preserve America's remarkable leadership in biotechnology, it shouldn't unintentionally harm America's leadership in biotechnology. And so we have to get this right at the end of the day.
So, John, I'm going to end on something a little bit different, but talking about the future. And your job here is to make this end on a positive note, despite the things I'm going to say. Okay.
Okay.
So I'm going to talk about the next generation and what's going on college campuses on a very personal level, which I'm going to put aside. This is deeply concerning to me. At a professional level, what I think is specifically concerning, and we must acknowledge that academia is a source of about 75% of industry's innovation, probably at least. And what we're seeing is in the leading institutions, which are the foundation of our industry, what I'm observing is an environment that is not fostering truly critical thinking, that there is a groupthink going on, but specifically an inability to express different views as a culture. And that is a threat not only to the academic enterprise, but to the generation of people that are going to be this industry's next leaders and are going to create those innovations. If you don't have people feeling free that they can say that's a terrible idea, then I think that's a real threat. Is that concern overblown? Only something good here.
No, I mean, look, I absolutely have that concern, Simone. I think freedom of speech, freedom of challenge is really important. Of course, at the same time, I don't think it should be directed in any negative way toward anybody personally or as a race. I mean, it cannot be done in a way that I've seen in some of the college campuses, which I disagree with at the end of the day. But without getting into that very sensitive topic, I would say more generally on education and the importance of education. I agree that we need to have an educational system in this country that fosters the next generation of leaders. But we also have to have, I would argue, a culture, and I spent a lot of time with young entrepreneurs on this topic. We also need to have time for these young leaders to recognize that they need to go work in companies. They need to go learn from being in a biotech company before they can go off and be a CEO someplace, right? And that's a little bit of a generational thing, I think, to some extent. The Gen Zers sort of have this wonderful aspiration. I think it's incredible that they have the courage in this regard. But they want to go right into, their own entrepreneurial journey right away. And we know in biotechnology in particular that they could benefit enormously by learning, by spending a decade, maybe 2 decades in companies and learning about drug discovery and drug development. It's the hardest thing in the world. It's like, landing a person on the moon. when you really think about it. So it is important that people learn about drug discovery and development. And a lot of that experiential learning, I think, can be an important part of the future for our new young talent out there.
Well, thanks for bringing it to a positive, John. It is always a pleasure to talk with you. I hope to do it again soon. Thank you.
Great, Simone. Thank you.